For decades, the idea of a third world war, it felt like something out of a history book or a movie, right? A distant kind of hypothetical fear. But that is changing, and it's changing fast. The question is no longer just what if? Now, global experts are actually trying to forecast it, putting real numbers and timelines on the risk. So let's dive in and break down what the data is telling us. First up, just how serious is this threat really? To get a handle on that, we're going to look at what hundreds of the world's top strategists are saying. And honestly, their collective view paints a pretty sobering picture of the decade we're heading into. So the Atlantic Council, which is a major foreign policy think tank, they didn't beat around the bush. They posed this very direct question to their whole network of experts. No fuzzy language, just a straight-up assessment of a truly devastating possibility. And the results, they're pretty striking. Get this. A staggering 40.5% of these experts, people who study this stuff for a living, believe a world war is a real possibility within the next 10 years. So we're not talking about some fringe idea here. This is a mainstream concern. Okay, so if the risk is that high, the next question you're probably asking is where? Where are the tripwires? What are the most dangerous spots on the map that could actually escalate into a global conflict? Well, the analysis points to a couple of familiar but increasingly fragile fault lines. First, there's the risk of a direct clash between Russia and NATO, most likely spinning out of the war in Ukraine. That the second one, what many reports are calling the most dangerous direct path, is a conflict over Taiwan involving the US and China. And look at these numbers. 65% of experts think China will try to forcibly retake Taiwan in the next decade. And maybe even more chilling, nearly half, 48%, expect nuclear weapons to actually be used somewhere in the world during that same period. But here's the thing. Beyond these traditional geopolitical hotspots, there's a powerful new factor that makes our current situation uniquely dangerous. And that factor is climate change, which is acting like a massive threat multiplier across the board. And this quote from the Nation Builder Risk Report just nails it. Climate is usually not the spark, but it does pile dry timber around the spark. It's a perfect way to think about it. Climate change itself probably isn't going to start a war, but what it does do is create all these background conditions, the dry timber, that make societies more fragile and make conflicts way more likely to ignite and just spread like wildfire. So what does this dry timber actually look like on the ground? Well, we're talking about things like critical food and water shortages that can destabilize a whole region. We're talking about mass migration, putting enormous pressure on borders. You've got increased stress on vital shipping lanes, and governments getting so financially strained that they just can't manage a crisis anymore. All of these things weaken the entire global system and seriously raise the risk of conflict. Okay, so let's try to put some hard numbers to this risk. The Nation Builder report gives a pretty sobering timeline of probability, showing how all these different stresses could interact and play out over the next few years. In a very near term, so by March 2027, the risk is estimated at about 8 to 12%. Now, that's still a minority outcome, right? The thinking is that powerful forces like nuclear deterrence and diplomacy will probably hold things together. But just a year and a half later, look at that jump. The risk essentially doubles. The report suggests this is the point when all these different crises, geopolitical, climate, resource shortages, could really start to synchronize, feeding off each other and stressing the whole system way, way more. By the end of 2030, we hit what this forecast calls the peak risk window. The probability jumps to between 24 and 34%. I mean, that's approaching a 1 in 3 chance. That is not a comfortable number. So the huge takeaway here is this specific window. 2028 to 2031. The report calls it the highest load-bearing horizon. That's kind of a fancy way of saying it's the period when the accumulation of all these different global stresses could reach a critical breaking point. So when experts are talking like this, you can bet that it starts to filter down into the public conversation. With all this analysis out there, it's really not surprising that people are also starting to think about what a modern global conflict would even look like. So let's pivot from the expert analysis and see how the public is imagining these potential sides. And if you go online to places like Reddit, you can see this playing out in real time. People are trying to map out the fault lines of a future war, basically drawing the battle lines based on today's alliances, rivalries, and tensions. And a pretty common pattern starts to emerge from all these discussions. People tend to imagine a potential axis bloc made up of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And on the other side, an allied bloc led by NATO and key partners in the Pacific, like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Australia. Now, of course, this is all just speculation,
but it tells you a lot about how people perceive the world's current divisions.
So, with all this troubling data and all this speculation, it leads to the big question: is a major war inevitable? Well, the forecasters are really, really clear on this point. These are warnings, not prophecies. The future isn't written in stone, and there are powerful forces working against this kind of outcome. In fact, to keep things honest, the Nation Builder report did what's called a red team review, which is where they basically try to poke holes in their own conclusions. On the one hand, maybe the forecast is too alarmist. Why? Because nuclear deterrence is still a massive deal, and leaders are usually very cautious about starting a catastrophic war. But, on the other hand, maybe it's too conservative. Our computer models are not great at predicting how one crisis can cascade into another, and things like intense political polarization at home can make it really hard for a country to manage a crisis effectively. Ultimately, the bottom line of these reports is that the chance of a great power war is no longer comfortably close to zero. It's a real, tangible risk. And that leaves us with the most important question of all: what can lower this risk the fastest? The analysis seems to point to three key areas: aggressive de-escalation between the major powers, building up buffers of food, water, and energy in fragile regions, and finally, making our early warning systems much, much stronger so we can stop small shocks from spiraling into global catastrophes. The path forward is definitely uncertain, but the areas where we need to act are becoming clearer every day.